So, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde, dear guests, it's unusual to see so many people in a live event. We are not used to this anymore. So I'm so happy that we are all here in this wonderful place. I only arrived this morning and had not the opportunity to take part yesterday, but as I hear from some conversations, everybody was very excited and it was a really good program. Actually a program which we say, how we say in German, auf Sicht gefahren. Yeah? We just knew the next day what was going on. We were still planning to do a live event not long ago, but then, for example, last week it was decided that we could not invite all the singers here, but that we have to do this form of event. This is our new normal, and the more I'm happy that you are all here. I have written down all on my paper, so yeah, the symposium today is part of our program, The Other Beethovens, which already started yesterday with Ode for All and Covered Culture. And after the symposium, in the late afternoon and in the evening, we will have trans-traditional concerts of the Trickster Orchestra as part of today's program. The starting point of The Other Beethovens for the Goethe-Institut was that we ask ourselves, what can a worldwide operating institution do when it's the jubilee of the composer who was played the most in last year? And one possible approach of us seemed to be to examine the role of Beethoven and classical music in the worldwide cultural context and in the worldwide cultural exchange more closely. One trigger point was the realization that Beethoven, as a child of his time, was interested in non-European exoticisms. He not only reflected upon them, but also proceeded them artistically. And this at a time when classical music of Western European character was increasingly spread in various regions of the world in the course of colonization and missionary work. The aesthetic misunderstandings, influences, possibly also indoctrinations of the other side, which were linked to the phenomena of interest, cultural appropriation and music export, that could already be observed at that times, and it's topics which are interesting for us today as well. Patrick Hahn will later examine Beethoven's interest in the Orient and related questions in more detail at the beginning of his panel with Sandeep Bhagwati. The project started in 2019 with a workshop, and that's what we very often do in the Goethe-Institut. We bring together experts from different countries to discuss how we can proceed with programs and what can we do on a special topic. The workshop in Munich with numerous international artists and scholars discussed these and other questions and develop initial ideas for new projects that correspond to these questions. And I just talked to Katie Milliken and she said, this workshop was so important for the project because completely new idea came up and triggered the whole going on of this Beethoven project. From this, a number of projects emerged to this day. Exactly, it was 11 I heard. That's a big number of projects, but only 3 can be experienced in this weekend because due to COVID-19, some of the projects had to be postponed or took a longer time to realize. Back to the symposium, Decolonizing Classical Musics. As you might know, for some time the Goethe-Institut has been dealing intensively with questions of decolonization, especially in the context of museum discussions and restitutions. Among other things, it has organized festivals and congresses to provide a forum for various interest groups to exchange ideas on this topic. The focus was primarily on objects and less on so-called immaterial art, such as music. However, in this context, terms such as looted music are used, raising questions similar to those of ownership and a responsible approach to cultural heritage. The increasing number of publications linked to these topics shows that there is an obvious need for exchange in this field. In this respect, the symposium comes at the right time, in my opinion, and is embedded in a lot of activities of the Goethe-Institut together with partners like the Humboldt Forum and others that we are organizing. This afternoon will be opened by a video keynote by musicologist Kofi Agawu, reflecting on the origins. I have to use my paper because I'm curious now what origins. Reflecting on the origins. I read it 3 times, but I didn't read it I learned it by heart. So, on the origins of art music in sub-Saharan Africa and the practice of post-colonial composition. The first impulse is, as I have already mentioned, provided by Patrick Hahn and Sandeep Bhagwati, who will discuss in a listening session historical misunderstandings regarding Oriental topoi in Western classical music and possibilities of establishing a fairer world music ecosystem. After that, the composers Birgitta Muntendorf, Kathy Milliken, Ormin Faisabodi, and the singer Svetlana Spajic, who all participated in projects within the framework of the other Beethovens, will address the question of trans-traditional composition and interpretation today. The symposium today will conclude with an outer-national listening session with the philosopher Timothy Morton and the post-colonial thinker Wendy M.K. Shaw, framed by 2 concerts of the Trickster Orchestra, which will address questions of post-colonial transformation musically and in cooperation with virtual guests from Bangkok, Chiang Mai, and Bangalore. How exciting it would be if they all could be here. At the beginning of the planning for this festival, and as this I mentioned, and thus also for the symposium, we assumed a physical event accompanied by a live stream. Corona has disturbed these plans, and so not only the productions, such as last night's Ode for All, which was reworked at short notice so that it could be performed without international singers on site, have changed, but also the symposium. We would have wanted to welcome live Kofi Agawu, who lives in the USA. Since this trip is not possible, he recorded his speech for us shortly before this event. Sandeep Bhagwati would also have liked to come from Zurich to Berlin to share the stage with Patrick Hahn for the second event, but now he has to be connected via video communication, as well as Svetlana Spajic, who should not only have sung last night, but also should have taken part in the panel. They all will take part virtually, so this is the typical hybrid format of the future, I think. The whole event will be streamed live and recorded for those who can't come to Berlin and can also be watched on YouTube. And in the end, it is very important for me in such a wonderful but also complicated project to thank all the partners in these projects and all the participants. First of all, our production partner, the Radialsystem, and its great team. And as we discussed in the beginning of today's day, my colleagues were so excited and so thankful to the technical team of the Radialsystem, what they made possible in such short-term time. We thank the BKM, which supported this part of the project taking place in Germany, Elisa Erkelens, who developed the content of the initial workshop I was talking about, and this symposium together with us, and is responsible for the Trickster concert tonight, the media partner Fan Outernational. I want to thank especially all my colleagues from the Goethe-Institut. Nathalie Feldmann, Ghazali Ibrahimi, Nicole Braun, the head of the musical department Jörg Süßenbach, as well as Selin Gündönüm and Reimar Volker from Istanbul, he's also here, and Clemens Streter from Beijing. Without the network of the Goethe-Institut, I think this program would not have been possible. And of course, I want to thank all participants, artists and scientists who are involved in the project, and I want to thank you for coming here today. Thank you very much.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Kofi Agawu. I teach at the Graduate Center in the City University of New York. Let me start off by saying it's an honor for me to participate in this symposium on decolonizing classical music. I'd like to thank Elisa Erkelens for the initial invitation and Natalie Feldman for her help with practical matters. My topic is Composing in the Post-Colony, a Perspective on African Art Music. What comes to mind when you think of African music? Is it this? Or is it this? And so on. Or might it be this? This is your third example. So on. The first and third are probably familiar. Number one is a song from Guinea entitled Kalefa Ba. It features kora player Mbadi Kuyate and his wife, singer Dariatu. Her voice reaches far. She enunciates clearly. Her melody is affecting, and the performance as a whole summons the Mande cosmos. Number three is a popular Southern Ewe dance, Agbaja, from Ghana. It's an index of the communal ethos and polyrhythmic expression that bind singers, dancers, and drummers together in collective action. But what about number two? A solo piano piece with a strong interrogative quality. This piece lacks a consistent pulse, invests in silence, trades in fragmentary gestures, and is essentially telling listeners, listen up, this is music to be contemplated. Is this also African music? Indeed, it is. It's the music of Nigerian composer Joshua Uzoigwe, whose dates are 1946 to 2005. A composer of great originality and enterprise, whose work displays the lineaments of post-colonial composition. outing a secret. If you did not know about music such as Uzoigwe's, you wouldn't be alone. For you see, a well-kept secret about Africa is the existence of a significant body of art music self-consciously composed by individuals, often notated, usually rehearsed and performed by skilled practitioners for non-participating or minimally participating audiences in designated modern spaces, churches, concert halls, community theaters, and private homes. The example you just heard, Ilulu, belongs to the genre of African pianism. For the composer, the piece is atonal and expressionistic, and indeed some listeners may be reminded of early 20th century European modernism. But Ilulu was composed in 1991, not 1911, and it was recorded in 2003 by Ghanaian-American pianist William Chapman Nyaho. Why do the major published sources of information on African music, including the periodical literature, routinely ignore this tradition of music, a tradition that has been around since the 19th century? What accounts for its underrepresentation in the work of leading European scholars, Rouget, Kubik, Arom, Ehrman, and so on, scholars who have devoted entire lifetimes to the study of African music and oral literature? Let me state the problem in a different way. If I present you with the names Ngugi, Ama, Shoyinka, Achebe, and Chimamanda, many will recognize them as leading African writers. Everyone has read Things Fall Apart, a canonical work of African literary imagination. Yes, it is written in the language of our colonial oppressors, well, sort of, but it inscribes experiences, values, and beliefs that many readers readily identify with. It evinces a post-colonial worldview. If, on the other hand, I were to provide you with another list, this time with the names Showande, Yuba, Tamusuza, and Labi, many of you will probably draw a blank. These are composers. Like their literary colleagues, they are attempting to exercise the African imagination, only this time in the medium of sound. Is there something about sound that impedes the circulation of their work? That seems unlikely. After all, artists like Fela, Angelique Kidjo, and Youssou N'Dour have managed to attract a huge international following from musical performances. Of course, they operate in the realm of urban popular music with its easy media-assisted circulation, not in the realm of art music. What accounts for the markedness of African art music? Well, be assured that I am not here today to sing a song of lament, nor am I going to whine about what Euro-America knows or does not know or does not wish to know about certain African musical practices. Rather, I want to use the existence of this secret to reflect on the entailments of an art music tradition. I will be suggesting that it is precisely the failure, perhaps even refusal, to come to terms with the realities of the post-colony that has impeded appreciation for a tradition whose historical emergence was inevitable, whose affordances for creativity considerable, and whose symbolic value for African modernity very high indeed. So the tradition. Time doesn't allow me to tell the whole story of African art music in this talk, so I'll make brief mention of two countries in which the tradition is thriving, Nigeria and Ghana. Art music owes its origins to the twin forces of missionization and colonization. Music played an important role in the realization of the goals of the missionary project, while colonial education provided avenues for the cultivation of musical interest through singing, playing of instruments, and in a few cases, composing. In his 1995 book on Nigerian art music, Bode Omojola lists and discusses the work of composers like Ashinvu, Akpabot, Bankole, Ekweme, Yuba, probably the most prominent of them, Ndubuisi, Nzewi, Omojola himself, Sado, Showande, the father of Nigerian art music, and Uzoegwe, whose music we heard earlier. And there's no comparable single source for the Ghanaian story, but well-known figures like Ephraim Amu, Kwabdan Ketia, Nayu, Jimalabi, the late Ken Kafui, and George Dorr have been the subject of individual studies, including self-studies. What kind of heritage do these composers possess? The first thing to note is that the heritage is multiple and eclectic. It stems from community-based traditional music. This is the music with the strongest claims to being of pre-European origin, probably like the Agbaja we heard earlier. Modifications of this tradition into new traditional forms, the ubiquitous popular music of Cuban, American, and British origins, and perhaps most important for our purposes in the symposium, selected European repertories, including hymns, simple classics, Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and a little encounter with the music of 20th century composers. You can see why I characterize the heritage as multiple and eclectic. Let me dwell for a moment on the European part of that heritage by citing a revealing source, the so-called seminary tunes published in 1907 by the Basel missionaries in Ghana and aimed at Twi-speaking tutors and students of the Ekropon Seminary. I'll share my screen and just show you the title page of that document. So you can see that it says seminary tunes, so you probably want to see the whole thing. So here, seminary tunes for the use of the seminary. Twi is the language, Akropong is the city, and the year is 1907. I'm going to say a few things about this. But while we're here, I just want to look ahead to the next slide that I have and ask you to hear this in your head if you can. This is a piece I will talk about in a minute. Full marks will go to whoever is able to identify this piece. Okay. So let me get on now and tell you a little bit about the seminary tunes. This compilation of 125 tunes served as a kind of musical Bible and profoundly influenced individuals like Amu, Nketia, and Arodansu, all of whom attended or taught at the seminary and who later became well-known composers. Three things stand out about this document of missionization. First, in assembling a musical diet for Africans whose souls were also being targeted for redemption, the Basel missionaries included work by a handful of well-known composers like Handel, spelled with the umlaut, Mozart, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn, alongside numerous works by lesser-known composers like Klein, Naegeli, Becker, Stern, Voigtländler, Kreutzer, and numerous others. Secondly, the musical material consists of chorales, opera choruses, and excerpts from oratorios, all fitted with tree words, not necessarily translations of the original texts. And there's one interesting exception, which is the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah, which retained the composer's original English text. But perhaps most interesting in the compilation are adaptations of secular instrumental melodies for this religious context. And this is where the example that I asked you to look at comes into play. I may have to have you look at it again. It's actually the theme from the slow movement of Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, here transformed into a hymn-like song and fitted with the words, "Good God, let's fear the Lord." A third feature of this compilation is the harmonic idiom. Harmonic idiom is firmly tonal in the common praxis sense of the term. Hierarchic structures anchored by a tonic dominant polarity control the movement at phrase levels. Secondary dominants are used occasionally, but there are few extended modulations. African composers brought up in such a milieu later found it impossible to escape the regimes of syntax and vocabulary imposed by this music. Regimes, it must be said, that were initially antithetical to those of indigenous musical expression. The result was a form of colonization, a colonization of musical consciousness, if you like. Sampling sound worlds. Now, I've dwelt on this 1907 compilation, Seminary Tunes, because I believe some such body of music lies behind the tonal thinking of most composers of Black African art music. Exposure and training don't tell the whole story, however. We also need to take into account the choices made by individual composers. Again, in the interest of time, I will first show a few pages of score, and this will constitute the visual evidence, if you like. And then we will listen to brief excerpts from 3 works. This will be the oral evidence. And by the way, more information can be found in numerous articles by Yuba, Omojola, Oluranti, Scherzinger, Dor, and others. So take a look at this score here. It's from Jima Labi's Timpani Concertino. I've just given you 2 bars of the music, or 2 sort of large segments of the music. This is from 1993. And then over here, a piece by Seun Owaje. This is a dramatic work. You can see the instrumentation laid out here. And here's a page from later on in the same piece with all these clusters. And next is an older piece by Ephraim Amu. As you can see, he likes to write a lot of triplets, as you can see. So you can get some sense of the rhythmic feel of this piece. And finally, does this seem familiar? This is the piece that we just listened to, Uzo Igwe's piano piece that I played at the beginning. Okay, so let me stop my share now and continue with my talk. Even this glance at the notation will convey something of what composing in the post-colony entailed. Titles, instrumentation, rhythm, harmony, melody, and style all signify multiply. I'd like just to have us listen to 3 excerpts from the works of African pianism, a work by Jima Labi, another by Bongani Ndodana Breen, and a third one by Akin Yuba. So 3 examples of African pianism. And here's the first by Jima Labi. I better set this up by telling you that this is a piece called Earth Beats. It's one of 5 dialects for piano. The pounding fury of the opening soon yields to a more lyrical, Akan-flavored material. But the drama of that opening is unfinished business, and the composer will return to it from time to time in the work. Here is Labi's Earth Beats. Akan-flavored section. And so on. Labi's Earth Beats. I want to play you another example, this one by Bongani Ndodana Breen. It's a piece called Flowers in the Sand, and it offers a different kind of temporal experience, a non-linear experience perhaps, as if sounds were being projected into space. Muted utterances form amidst a quiet and circular doodling. Here's Ndodana Breen's Flowers in the Sand. And so on. And thirdly and finally, I'll play you a little bit of Akin Yuba's Igba Kerin. Here is the inventor of African pianism himself with a lively composition that sports a huge choreographic supplement. Indeed, a lot of West African art music lives here. I should say that there are hundreds and hundreds of such works in various genres: chamber music, art songs, choral music, operas, including folk operas, orchestral music, and so on. I doubt that any fair-minded critic would dismiss this music out of hand or discourage people from listening to it or deprioritize it in surveys of African music. So why does the African art music tradition remain little known? Resisting African art music. Saul Bellow once famously said, quote, "When the Zulus produce their Tolstoy, we will read him," end of quote. Lurking behind that seemingly innocent claim is skepticism about the abilities of others, those others being Blacks, people of color, non-Western people. Choose your umbrella. If we take Saul Bellow at his word, the standard for measuring African art music's worth will be set by a member of the European avant-garde, and I dare not mention any names here. By these lights, pitch organization in African art music, for example, may seem conservative. Aspects of this music may seem displaced from the Euromodern, as if the century from 1820 to about 1920 simply didn't happen. By this argument, critics claim that African composers are writing music that has, as it were, been previously written. They are, in effect, rewriting the West's achievements, taking us back instead of forward. But to pursue this claim of a temporal displacement, you would have to imagine a linearity to European musical history that is simply false. Yes, conventional narratives have it that tonal harmony, for example, became increasingly chromatic in the 19th century and reached a high point in the atonal music of the early decades of the 20th. But the aftermath of the 1920s, not only in jazz, blues, or popular music, but in some styles of classical music, like minimalism or post-minimalism, could hardly be described as progressive complexification of harmony. What we witness instead are new patterns of co-presence in the parameters of a work. It is this recontextualization that accounts for some of the novelty in African art music, occluding the post-colonial condition. Now, if the quality argument is, as it were, porous, we must look elsewhere for an explanation of our secret. Could it be a poor understanding of the very conditions of the musical post-colony, the complex layers of sedimented cultural and stylistic influences, and the values that shape the choices made subjectively by individual composers? If so, what we need is a thick description of the worlds that each individual composer inhabits. Again, such a construction would be beyond the scope of a short talk like this. We might gain some insight, however, by reflecting on two terms that are mainstays of post-colonial criticism: hybridity and essentialism. Hybridity. So central to post-colonial expression, or so the story goes, is hybridity, the interaction of elements of different, sometimes radically different provenance. At first sight, compositions such as Labis or Yubas or Uzoigwe's may be described as hybrid. There are problems with deploying that term, however. First is the implication that other compositions are non-hybrid or even pure, presumably the opposing term. Is Uzoigwe's music beholden to hybridity in a way that Brahms's or Stravinsky's works are not? To raise the question is to expose the fragility of the claim. For by the time you're done excavating the various topoi that animate the music of Mozart or Mahler, Debussy or Britten, Stravinsky or Kurtag, you'll probably become wary of the actual existence of non-hybrid musical material. The second problem is the failure to historicize hybridity instead of hypostatizing it. We need to follow the changing meanings of the interacting elements and grant that something judged to be hybrid in one time period may lose that aura in a subsequent period. The third problem concerns the pejorative associations of the term, the implication that it betrays some kind of divided consciousness, shall we say. It is not at all clear that a composer who routinely combines 3-against-2 rhythms with authentic cadences and asymmetrical phrase construction is plagued by a divided consciousness. In language use, code switching comes naturally to speakers of a Creole language. The musical equivalent of linguistic code switching is a more elusive proposition, however, because the codes themselves bleed at their edges, relinquishing any autonomy they might possess. So, to imply that individuals are laboring under competing allegiances because of the diverse origins of their materials is to mischaracterize this aspect of musical creativity. It is, in fact, to erect borders where none exist. Essentialism. Another challenge to the reception of African art music is the reliance, sometimes overtly, other times covertly, on essentialist attributes. Let me approach this problem by way of an anecdote. One of my students told me of a visiting European composer who had gone to Ghana to run a composition workshop. He would constantly enjoin the African students to be themselves. Now, when a European tells you to be yourself, when he seems to know in advance what sonic form that self should take, you might wish to be alert to a looming ideological imposition. For this particular instructor, the essentialized African sound is evidently rhythmic, and so be yourself means write music that is rhythmically complex, where incidentally complexity is to be judged from a European perspective, a perspective that almost certainly excludes the subtle sedimentations of language in African rhythmic expression. An obstacle to the open reception of African art music thus develops from this desire to see Africans thinking African musical thoughts. A post-colonial perspective would reposition essentialism as a strategic choice. It would not deny those patterns of musical investment that history and anthropology have shown to be valid, but it would struggle against and indeed reject the undercomplicating of our lived experience. To decolonize or not. I've been urging a more nuanced understanding of the post-colony, but since coloniality and missionization are key historical enablers of African art music, I must, in closing, make a comment about recurrent calls for decolonization. Decolonization here presumably refers not to the discourse about music, the writings of scholars and critics, but to the discourse of the music itself, including the very structures that enable composition. So what would it mean to decolonize African art music? Historically, decolonization has typically engendered two kinds of reaction, one a turning inwards and the other a turning outwards. One turns inwards to reclaim indigenous territory, including knowledge and expression, presumably under a real or perceived threat from outside forces. Language and its associated thought systems are the key vehicles for executing this turn. There is, however, a reciprocal turn to the outside, this outside carrying both spatial and temporal valencies. For if the point of turning inwards is to recover something lost, the ultimate test of that recovery is that it engender new, presumably more grounded forms of creativity. These new forms, in turn, are aimed at contemporary audiences. In addressing what we might call the post-colonial contemporary, then, the artist is simultaneously concerned with past residue and future prospect, as well as local and translocal reception. A number of African composers have already taken steps in this direction. Uzo Igwe, for example, studied a set of Igbo-tuned drums, ukom, and extracted elements and processes from that study for use in composition. He was seeking to ground his work in an African sound field, not only affectively, but structurally. Similarly, Nketia in the 1940s drew inspiration from the dirges sung by his grandmother in Mampong. He did this to produce new music with aspirations to transcend the local while also addressing a contemporary imperative. So it would not be an exaggeration to say that African composers have been engaged in modest decolonial acts. These tentative steps typically take an incorporative stance rather than a separatist one. So instead of imagining an art music tradition purged of ostensible European influence, that's simply a chimera, African composers have sought change from within, transforming existing materials and practices, the things we came to meet, we would say, in response to new awakenings. It's all a gradual process. Finally, it bears repeating that Europe's desires for decolonization are shaped by its histories and experiences of its actors. So even if the underlying impulses resonate with Africa's, we must not assume that we share the same goals. So instead, for example, of exporting Europe's neuroses about its influential figures to the erstwhile colonies, we might allow those who wish to creatively appropriate things tagged as colonial, including Beethoven, by the way, to do so, especially when such appropriation seems obviously empowering. In making this concession, notions of whiteness or Europeanness will not be wielded as self-evident categories when it comes to creativity. Creative practices are fields of possibility shared by others, fields that may be tagged with different colors, black, brown, or yellow. In this way, African composers will not be cast into a defensive mode when it comes to justifying their work. They will not be sent on a wild goose chase seeking to identify non-white spaces that they can call their own, spaces that are thought to be different. They will read the injunction to be yourself pragmatically and opportunistically. In short, the cat is by now out of the bag. African art music may not have attained the degrees of salience achieved by popular music or traditional music, but its composers are thriving within a pluralistic soundscape. This music's potential is enormous, comparable perhaps to the potential of African literary and theatrical production that has proved seminal to the discourses of post-colonial theory and world literature. It may in fact be that as calls to action, post-colonialism inscribes a different set of priorities from decolonization. The futures imagined by post-coloniality tend to provincialize Euro-America, whereas those associated with decolonization remain fixated on pasts denied by Europe. The distinction is not absolute, of course, but it points to different priorities. The African art music tradition that I have described in this paper seeks to inscribe a modernity that undergoes constant redefinition. The tradition is dynamic. For the purposes of this symposium, then, its entailments are meant to sound a few cautionary notes. Thank you.